time will come that whosoever kills you will think he's doing God a favor. And believe me, that's Islam from the word go.
Good evening and welcome to the rest of the news. We have an earth-shaking program for you today, and our special guest is Ed Holloway, who is a former state representative. And Ed, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, you know, one of the things that is shocking to me is this 70 or 75,000 Muslim refugees that are being brought into the United States.
Right. This is a
new group.
New group from Syria. We now have several hundred in Jefferson County in Kentucky, and they're bringing more in as we talk. But the thing is that this is just a sampling of every state now has a Muslim base, and it's growing. If you noticed the news recently, they just built a new mosque in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they have 7,000 refugees there, and 2,000 of those are Burmese Muslims. So each one of these groups, or depending on the country they originate from, has their own organizational name. So we get confused with all of these Arabic-type names, and from the Quran, and it becomes things. But the whole thing goes back to the structure that was settled by the Islamic Brotherhood. And over the last 25 years, they've grown from 3 separate little organizations to a total of 49 now.
Let's go something now that is so dynamic, these charts, Rexel, and I'll explain each one as you put them up.
Yes, I'm going to be putting on a chart the number of jihadist groups worldwide by the year. Hey, I'm going to start at 1988, and then I'm going to go up to 2013. Jack, there's a huge difference there.
25 years.
Yes,
from 3 to 49.
Well, you know, Ed, there was a program by Jack Van Ippy recently that went into documenting how these different military organizations are in different states.
Right.
Now let's see their motto, if you will, please. The official motto of the Muslim Brotherhood is, Allah is our objective. The Prophet is our leader. The Quran is our law. Dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope, as it promotes jihad.
They are behind the holy war. And jihad, they say, is what we want.
All right, I'm going to go to the locations of major militant Islamic groups right here in the United States. And whoa, what a shock that is, all the way from Seattle to Boca Raton, Florida. Oh my, oh my.
That's a classic example of what's going on, and all of the things that are happening have been very subtle, and they've happened like they've been going on. But what we can use for a comparison is what's gone on in Europe.
Yes.
England is a classic example. They now have 100 no-go zones.
Oh, and Rexel, they got 55 no-go zones in Sweden. They have 100 in England, and they're afraid to go in those places because they might be killed. I'm talking about the police.
And what's going on in those areas is atrocious. There have been 1,400 young Christian children who have been abused by these gangs of rapists. But under jihad and all that, that's acceptable because and this is another thing they're using to attract all of these young men from not only the United States but from all over to join ISIS, because they're then allowed to conduct all these kind of rape, pillage, and plunder. And a woman, it is non-Muslim, is nothing but a sex slave. So all of those things are going on, and nobody will do anything about it because they're afraid that we've gone into this thing about Islamophobia or racism or all those things about anything that's mentioned about the Muslim or their culture. And it's devastating to try to unravel all of the things that are happening. And at the same time, we're bringing in all of these Muslims
Yeah.
from all over the world and bringing them into the United States by the thousands. At the same time, in those countries where ISIS and others are growing, the Christian population there have become refugees, but none of those are being brought to the United States.
Well,
And I think it's one of the most atrocious example of our inability to look and recognize the true nature of not only Islam, but what's happening on this process of bringing in immigrants.
the current administration and UN and
Right.
all of that are picking out just non-Christians to bring in. Well, you know, this is all over the internet. I have a couple of articles here, and it shows how Christian refugees denied visas to the West. And here's another one. Obama has no room in USA for Christian refugees, Muslims only. So this is very well documented.
And unfortunately, our media is not sharing this with the general
That's right.
public.
That's
And
right.
it's causing a real problem because average person doesn't know it until it happens to them. And our system, not only the educational system where people, the educational system trying to teach people who don't speak our language, who have other goals and objectives. Our medical system is overloaded with refugees for free medical treatment. And in Britain, for example, and several other European countries, a Muslim with as many as 4 wives can have each one of them covered by medical. And all these things are putting a tremendous economic burden on our systems. And there's no way that they can assimilate those people into our system. And and I'll use an example. The University of Kentucky has a professor who is a Muslim, and he teaches a Muslim. Well, he's a part of CAIR, CAIR, which is the Council of American Islamic Relations, and he's been there, and was a former chairman of that. But I think he pretty well sums it up when he stated that ultimately we Muslims can never be full citizens of this country because there is no way that we can fully commit to the institutions and ideology of this country.
Imagine that. In
And
other
this-
words, they're not coming over here to become citizens like other refugees. They're coming over here to, like you say, establish a no-go zone or
And they're having Sharia law in those communities, 10,000 of them in Minnesota. And if you remember the number of young men that they've tried to stop, others that have gone back to Syria, and others that are joining the fight and are part of the thousands of European and American citizens who have joined with ISIS against the West. So it's an increasing problem. And it's one that will continue to grow as more and more of these refugees come in.
Now, I showed you the locations of the militant groups in America. Let me show you their camps in America. And there they are, all the way from New York to California, Texas, Oklahoma, and Michigan and Colorado.
And this is a part of what, and you have to understand where all of this comes from. It's almost 100 years ago at the end of the First World War and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And in that process, all of these boundaries and all these things were created, and it left the Islamic world in total chaos. The tribes were split, territories were split, all of those things, and they're now having an ability to create through Facebook and all of the other internet breakdowns to communicate with them among themselves and to create this monster that they're building, because they want to take and reconstruct a caliphate that will in the end dominate the whole United States and the rest of the world combined. And it's a very serious thing, and they're very dedicated to it, and they're very persistent, and they have one element that most of our Western people don't have, and that's extreme amount of patience. They don't care if it happens this year, next year, 100 years from now, but they will exceed and they will prevail. They don't want to assimilate. They don't want to be Americans. They want the caliphate. They want to go back to jihad against all of the infidels, whether you're an atheist, a Christian, a gay, or whatever you are. That doesn't matter to them, and you're a free game in their thing, and you have to be either converted or destroyed.
Well, now, here's an article. It says, Pan-European Arab Muslim gang rape epidemic.
It's going on. There's been 1,400 British girls that have been attacked by these rapes. And if you say anything about it, then you're criticized. And we have an article, one lady that said, pretty well say, people ask me why I keep going back.
Yeah.
And there's one woman that was raped several times. And even then she was threatened that if she didn't, then she was, her farm, her house was going to be firebombed.
Yeah.
And they were going to rape her own mother and anything else if I tried to escape. So these are the things that are happening, and law enforcement themselves feel their hands are tied. The political groups, the ones that are concerned about all of the Islamic fallout and backlash, are not doing a thing about any of this stuff because you're being accused of being anti-Muslim, you're anti, and all of these things
a racist or
are
something.
Calling the problem. But we also have political leaders who are enabling all of this stuff to continue and putting pressure on local officials and others.
Well, you know, as you're talking, it occurred to me, I wonder if that's the same thing that's happening in America with these 70,000 new Muslims that are being brought in.
Well, the same thing is about to occur here. There's certain areas in certain areas in this country, like in Minneapolis and southern major cities, where they have a large contingent of Muslims, where it's almost a no-go zone. That we know the local media and others won't cover it. Nobody wants to go in there, and they're developing their own culture and Sharia law, and they're taking care of their own.
Right, right. You know, the thing that was most shocking to me about this immigration in England was, like you say, they've got thousands of girls, and here's an article where they went into like an orphanage and got these young girls, 10, 11, 12 years old, and repeatedly raped them with the gangs of maybe a half a dozen adult men. I can't get over that.
It's the largest British charity organization, but the problem is the person who is in charge of that is himself a Muslim.
Absolutely.
And he covers it up and refuses to deal with it, and it just continues to be one thing after another that nobody wants to deal with.
It seems like the courts and even the police authorities don't want to really correct the problem. Right. They just say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it because we don't want to be called a racist, so they just let it go. Now, here's this article from Sweden. It says, Sweden, the rape capital of the West. I think they mean Europe, especially. Okay, and here again, the Swedish parliament has been letting more and more Muslims into their country, like we're talking about these new 70,000. And since that happened, there was a 300% increase in violent crime and 1,472% increase in rape.
All right. And well, that's another thing. In the Swedish courts are an example. They've demonstrated sympathy for the rapist and have been acquitted.
Unbelievable.
Constantly acquitted the rapist. And when the rapist have then claimed that the girl who wanted to have sex with 6 or 7 or 8 men, it was her fault.
It was her fault.
Right.
For these young girls.
And then they're acquitted. So it goes back out and nobody wants to deal with it. And the internet radio stations have covered some of this, but then they're then penalized, and nobody wants to talk about it. So.
No country in Europe has done more to embrace the multicultural dream, than Sweden, meaning no country has opened its arms wider to Muslim immigration. And these days, every piece of news that comes out of Sweden is more and more disturbing. Now we hear that the government there is so determined to dilute their culture clean out of existence that they have actually changed the constitution without consulting the people. And you no longer have to be a Swedish citizen to hold sensitive or high government office, including national prosecutor, interestingly enough. And Swedes are constitutionally obliged to practice multiculturalism. In other words, it's now unconstitutional to uphold Swedish values in Sweden.
You are not engaging in population evolution, you're engaging in population transformation.
European leaders seem to grow more wary of immigrants.
As recent waves of immigration, legal and illegal, have come in from Eastern Europe and from Africa and the Middle East, public opinion polls have shown a demand for stricter controls.
Now, Ed, this is another video that we were talking about that goes into how all of this infiltration by Muslims has a plan behind it.
Exactly.
Let's show real quick this other video.
It's been over 7 years since a church group from another state brought a couple hundred refugees to the rural county where I live. I wanted to know, how could they do this? What was the governmental process that allowed the resettlement of refugees to a county ill-prepared to assimilate them? Employment opportunities were scarce. The health department was not familiar with illnesses and mental health problems of people who came from parts of the third world. The school system was not prepared to teach large numbers of students who didn't speak English, and subsidized housing was scarce. I wanted to know who gave permission for what amounted to a dropping off of needy people in our county seat. So I began my research and posted everything I learned to a blog, Refugee Resettlement Watch, so that others might know what I learned about a federal program that is 35 years old this year. In summary, I discovered that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was choosing most of our refugees. It's under the influence of a powerful Muslim supremacist group called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Not surprisingly, a large number of U.S.-bound refugees are coming from countries with large numbers of people who hate us, including Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and soon from Syria, just to name a few. The U.S. State Department then distributes the refugees to 9 major federal contractors, 6 of which are so-called religious charities, but all are largely funded from the U.S. Treasury. They're not passing the plate on Sundays for the $1 billion price tag for the resettlement. And that figure does not include the extensive welfare benefits refugees receive. The refugees are then sent to over 190 cities and towns in the U.S. where the 9 major contractors support 350 subcontractors. The refugees receive help from the subcontractor for up to 6 months, and the subcontractor then submits paperwork to admit the relatives of the first group. As the years have passed, I've become increasingly alarmed by the percentage of problematic Muslim refugees admitted and distributed around the U.S. through this program. By the way, the Refugee Resettlement Program is not the only one used for legally admitting Muslims, but it is one of the most important. Many are forming cities within cities. Perhaps you know one where you live, where mosques are being built to consolidate, train, and promote a growing American Muslim population and its Islamic supremacist doctrine called Sharia. This process of Muslim colonization is called the Hijra. Muhammad told his followers to migrate and spread Islam in order to dominate all the lands of the world. He said they were obliged to do so, and that's exactly what they are doing now with the help and support of the UN, the U.S. State Department, and the Christian and Jewish groups assigned to seed them throughout the country. Your tax dollars pay for it all. I've written this little book, Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America, so that you will know what is happening to us and what we can do about it. We only need to look to a troubled Europe to see the path ahead for America if we can't stop this migration, and stop it soon. There's no reason on earth that we should have brought over 100,000 Somalis and another 100,000 Iraqi Muslims to America. Soon we will be resettling Syrian Muslims in large numbers. The UN at the moment has over 10,000 in a pipeline destined for our towns. The FBI told Congress recently that they cannot be properly screened. If you don't help counter the Hijra, we are, in my opinion, doomed. Over time, this migration will be more devastating to your children and grandchildren and to our country than any terrorist attack could ever be. Learn more at Refugee Resettlement Watch and SecureFreedom.org.
Now, this lady seems to be very well informed.
She lived in a small community, and all of a sudden they had several hundred of these immigrants, and then that led her to question, how did this happen? Why did this happen? All of that. And she's done extensive research. And then she looked again at the European model and what was happening there. And the unchecked immigration, and the bottom line, it leads to chaos created by the population explosion of Sharia-loving immigrants that come in who have no intention of ever assimilating.
Right.
And it continues to increase, and as that burden is placed on the communities, it overloads the complete system from education to medical, as we talked about before, all the way down the line, and then the taxpayer is picking up the tab for this.
Right. One of these articles said there was $1 billion a year
Exactly.
costing you and me
Right.
and our viewers for all of this education and food and housing and welfare and all of that these people
And all of the people in the bureaucratic structure are enablers who started this. And if you look at, even go back to the White House with the President of the United States, his chief advisors, all of those people. Valerie Jarrett, for example, calls herself an Iranian American. She grew up in Iran. She has her feet, and she's been involved in back-channel negotiations with Iran in preparation for this so-called treaty that's never materialized and probably never will. All of those things are going on to try to pacify and calm the irritable Muslims that are in Iran and others, and it's not working. In fact, it's enabling them to even accelerate their activities.
Well, you know, the one thing that I keep coming back to and I can't get out of my mind is, why is the Obama administration and the United Nations bringing all of these Muslims into America? Is it going to turn out just like England and Sweden and Europe? And why are they doing it? And why are no Christians brought in? Only Muslims.
One of the problems when you look at the United Nations, over 57 countries now are total Muslim countries, and becoming more influential in the committees and other activities of the UN. And when they're making this, and they're constantly in this effort to make a one world organization, a one world this or one world that. And all of those things are compounding the problem and diverting our thought process from one issue to another and never focusing on a major problem. And it continues. But we have now 49 states in the United States that have Muslim immigrants that have been brought in. Food stamps, subsidized housing, health care, and
education.
They're having a tremendous impact that other legal immigrants never had on the communities.
Right, and they don't want to become American citizens.
And that's another thing, that they hate everything about the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the professor at the University of Kentucky summed it up pretty well. We can never assimilate into the American system.
Yeah, I think that there's something behind this. They get all of these Muslims, but no Christians. And the Christians are the ones that are being beheaded, burned alive, kicked out of their country, and tortured and raped and all of that. It's the Christians that are primarily the ones that are doing that. Well, we don't care about that. We're just going to bring in our buddies from the Muslims.
And all of our friends who helped us when we went into Iraq are being persecuted and executed, and it sends a message to anybody else. If you ever help the West on any issue, then you're subject to jihad and extermination. And it'll not continue. It's going to grow. But one good news is there are pockets of resistance taking place in this country. There are certain cities and others says, wait a minute, you're not going to bring any more refugees
Right.
in here.
We're not going to
So
take
there's
it.
some political leaders that are beginning to get their backs up and say, wait a minute, this is enough is enough. We can take care of a few people, but don't overload our system and don't destroy our
And don't
community.
discriminate against Christians that
That's
that
it.
are in
Yeah,
need.
Exactly. But everyone, including the media, have been told, "Oh, you're a racist. You're
Oh,
you're
yes.
homo-" And
Now, we're going to make a DVD out of this program, and we'd like to send all of our listeners a copy of this DVD. I think that if you and your relatives and neighbors and friends at work and at church get this DVD and show it to other people, it will begin to wake people up and they can see what we're up against in this country.
absolutely, and it's imperative because we've covered a tremendous amount, and it's very frustrating because there's so much to cover and so many things to tell. In fact, we've got 9 different religious organizations that are contractors that are part of this. And while Christians have always been compassionate and caring and loving, at the same time, they're not looking at the depth of what's involved
Absolutely.
and who these people are. And when we bring in refugees, there's no screening. There's no nothing. They're just bringing in them by the thousands. So we don't know who these immigrants are, whether there's probably some good Muslims involved, but at the same time, they're using all these jihad-trained Muslims that are the fighters for Islam, are part of these so-called refugees.
Right,
And that's the insidious part that's taking place. And when they get resettled and into these communities, and they're building mosque after mosque, and the mosques become training centers, our FBI and others have told you cannot infiltrate a mosque or find out what's going on internally. They're using jihadist-type clerics to teach the young people as they come through this system, and it continues to increase.
Now, the number to call to get your copy of this DVD that we're making of this program is 893-2444, and you can call that number right now. There's an answering machine if nobody's there, and leave your contact information. We'll get that out to you right away, immediately. That number again is 893-2444. So call that number right now, and we'll get your copy of this program out to you immediately, and it's all free. Okay, we want to thank Ed Holloway for helping us with this program, and tune in again next week for the rest of the news.
And then going on here, the Muslim Brotherhood comes where? To the White House. Now let's see about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian president had something pretty powerful to say. Egyptian President, Muslim Brotherhood is the godfather of global terrorism.